Hello, everyone. Have you ever had a moment where a single sentence shattered your world? In today's story, Margaret Sullivan, a 68-year-old mother who poured her heart and soul into her family, faces a gut-wrenching betrayal when her daughter-in-law calls her a plague that ruined our lives. Right in the backyard, she lovingly prepared for a family reunion. What follows is Margaret's tearful yet empowering journey to reclaim her identity, confront painful truths, and build a life that's truly hers. Will she forgive, or will she let go to protect her heart and her future? Join us for this deeply moving tale of family, sacrifice, and finding strength in the golden years. Please leave a comment below sharing your thoughts, where you're from, or how this story touched you. If you love heartfelt stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a video. Let's dive in. Margaret Sullivan stood in her modest backyard garden, her weathered hands gripping a watering can. At 68, she still tended to her flowers every morning, though her knees ached and the Florida sun sapped her energy more than it used to. The garden wasn't much, just a few marigold beds, a small orange tree, and a neatly trimmed lawn. But today, Margaret had spent hours making sure everything was perfect. Today was the family reunion, the first in months, and she wanted it to be just right for her son James, his wife Linda, and her 2 grandchildren. "Mom, where should I put the ice?" James, 45, appeared from the back door, hauling 2 heavy bags. His voice was warm, but his boyish smile still reminded Margaret of her late husband Henry, who'd passed 22 years ago from a sudden heart attack. "In the cooler, sweetheart," Margaret replied, smoothing her light blue blouse. She watched James walk toward Linda, who stood near the outdoor table, her back to Margaret. Linda, as usual, had arrived late, but Margaret had learned not to mention it. Linda's tight smile and perfunctory hug whenever they greeted said enough. Margaret had long accepted that their mother-in-law, daughter-in-law relationship would never be the warm bond she'd once hoped for. As she turned to fetch the salad from the kitchen, Linda's voice cut through the yard, sharp and disdainful. She clearly thought Margaret was out of earshot. "It's always the same with her," Linda said, her tone biting. "These forced family gatherings, like we're obligated to show up and pretend we're one big happy family. She's always hovering, always sticking her nose in our business, always holding that money over our heads." A neighbor's dog barked in the distance. Margaret froze, her hand on the screen door. That money, the mortgage payments she'd been making on James and Linda's house for the past 10 years. The savings she'd scraped together by selling Henry's prized antique watch collection. The one thing he'd asked her to keep. The money she'd sacrificed her dreams of traveling to Italy, her afternoons with friends, to ensure her son had a home. She turned slowly, her heart pounding. James saw her first, his face draining of color. Linda followed his gaze, startled but not ashamed. "Margaret," she began, then stopped, clearly unable to soften what Margaret had overheard. The backyard fell silent. Margaret's brother-in-law, Tom, stared at his beer. His wife, Ellen, suddenly fussed with her sunglasses. Her grandchildren, Sophie and Ethan, 10 and 7, played obliviously with the sprinkler on the lawn. "A plague that ruined your lives," Margaret repeated, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "That's what I am to you?" James stepped forward. "Mom, Linda didn't mean—" "I heard exactly what she meant." Margaret cut him off, locking eyes with Linda, whose chin lifted defiantly. "The plague that ruined your lives has been paying your mortgage for 10 years. But don't worry, I won't ruin your lives much longer." She set the salad bowl down carefully, as if it might break, and walked through the house. Grabbing her purse from the hall table, she stepped out to her car. She didn't cry until she was inside, doors locked. The tears came in heaving sobs she muffled against the steering wheel. For 40 minutes, she waited for James to come after her, to apologize, to say anything. No one came. As she drove away, she caught a glimpse of them in the rearview mirror, still in the backyard, the barbecue continuing as if she'd never been there. Margaret's small brick house in suburban Tampa had been her home since before James was born. After Henry died, she'd had chances to sell it, to downsize, but she'd kept it, thinking James might need it someday, that Sophie and Ethan deserved a yard to play in when they visited. Now, sitting alone in her living room, staring at the family photos on the wall, she wondered if she'd been wrong. She opened an old photo album, flipping through pictures of James, a gap-toothed toddler, his high school graduation in a green cap and gown, his wedding day with Linda, her smile tight even then. Christmases, birthdays, camping trips, moments Margaret had cherished, believing they were the foundation of a loving family. She picked up the wedding photo on her nightstand, studying Henry's confident smile and her own hopeful eyes. They'd been so young, so sure love was enough. "What would you do?" she whispered to his image. The ticking of the wall clock was her only answer. In the 22 years since Henry's death, Margaret had given everything to build this family. She'd gone back to work as a nurse the day after his funeral, taking extra shifts to keep James in college. She'd paid off his credit card debts, helped him buy his first car, and when he married Linda, she'd given $60,000 from her savings for their house down payment. For 10 years, she'd made their mortgage payments, totaling over $180,000, not to mention the emergencies, like when Linda needed a new SUV for the kids' safety, or when Sophie needed violin lessons. Now, alone in her quiet house, Margaret realized she'd sacrificed too much. Her youth, her dreams, her financial security, for the belief that family came first. But as she thought of the backyard, where the party went on without her, she wondered if that belief had been misguided. 3 days passed in silence, broken only by a few texts from Ellen asking if she was okay. Margaret didn't respond. On the 4th day, her phone rang, James's name on the screen. She hesitated through 5 rings before answering. "Mom?" James said, his voice tight. "Linda wants to apologize." "Only Linda?" Margaret asked, her voice hollow. "I mean, we're sorry. Linda was just having a bad day. You know how she gets when she's stressed about money." Margaret closed her eyes, remembering the day Henry died. She was 46, suddenly a widow with a mortgage, half the income, and a 23-year-old son who needed her. She'd gone back to the hospital the day after the funeral, working herself to exhaustion so James wouldn't drop out of school. "Mom, you still there?" James asked. "I'm here," she said, opening her desk drawer where she kept important documents. "James, do you remember when you and Linda wanted to buy the house you're living in?" He hesitated. "Of course." "What did the bank say?" "They said we didn't qualify for the loan." "And what did I do?" James sighed. "You put down $60,000 and signed for the loan." "Not just signed," Margaret corrected. "The house is in my name because your credit was so bad. I've been paying the mortgage for 10 years. That's over $180,000. We've been struggling, Mom. Linda's business isn't doing as well as she hoped, and the kids need so much." Margaret thought of Sophie and Ethan, sweet kids she rarely saw, despite living just 30 minutes away. "Do you remember when you called me at 3 a.m. because Linda's car broke down and you needed $5,000 for repairs? Or when Ethan needed braces and your insurance wouldn't cover it? Or when Sophie wanted ballet lessons? Are you keeping score?" James's voice took on an edge, like Linda's. Do you want us to feel indebted to you forever? No, Margaret said, closing the drawer. I want respect, James. I want appreciation. I'm sorry if you don't feel respected, James said, his tone making it clear he wasn't sorry. But we're drowning, Mom. Linda's stressed about her business, and the kids always need something. Margaret recognized the familiar pattern. James made her feel guilty, then presented a problem only she could solve. How much? She asked, the question automatic after so many years. What? How much do you need this time? A pause. $10,000, just to catch up on bills. I promise we'll pay you back. The same promise he'd made dozens of times. Margaret closed her eyes, recalling Henry's words. You can't pour from an empty cup, Maggie. She'd been pouring from an empty cup so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to be full. I need time, she said. Time? Mom, these bills are due this week. I need time to think about everything, about this relationship, about what it's cost me. Cost? James's voice rose, indignant. Is that all we are to you? A cost? We're your family, Mom. Your only family. I have to go, Margaret said, suddenly exhausted. Let me think. She hung up before he could say more, before he could pull her back into their familiar cycle. The next morning, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by photo albums and a cold cup of coffee. Her phone buzzed with a text from Ruth, her best friend of 35 years. Coffee today, Maggie? Ruth and Margaret had worked together at the hospital, enduring long night shifts and the hard years after Henry's death. Ruth was always blunt, having warned Margaret about helping James too much. Now, in Ruth's cozy living room, sunlight streaming through the windows, Margaret recounted the barbecue. I've been worried about you, Ruth said, studying her face. Ellen told me what happened. Linda has some nerve. Did you know? Margaret asked. How they really feel about me? Ruth sighed. I tried to tell you, Maggie. Remember 5 years ago, when you paid $40,000 for their kitchen remodel? I said they were taking advantage of you. You told me Linda was just misunderstood. Margaret looked down, remembering. Linda had shown her the plans. Granite countertops, walnut cabinets, a wine fridge Margaret could never afford in her own home. When she'd suggested something more modest, Linda's disappointment was palpable. James said you were excited to help, she'd said. But if you can't afford it... Margaret had written the check the next day. When was the last time they invited you for dinner? Ruth asked. When did James call just to check on you, not to ask for money? Margaret couldn't recall. The realization settled in her chest like a stone. They come for holidays, she said weakly. Christmas? Thanksgiving? When you give expensive gifts or cook the whole meal, Ruth interrupted. Maggie, you deserve better than this. That afternoon, Margaret drove past James and Linda's house, a sprawling 2-story colonial in an upscale neighborhood. The lawn was pristine, the flower beds vibrant, all maintained by the landscaping service she paid for. She slowed, noticing a new SUV in the driveway. Linda stepped out, dressed in tennis whites, laughing as she got into the car. Not the behavior of someone drowning in debt. A cold anger settled in Margaret's stomach. That evening, she opened her banking records on her computer. Over the past 12 years, she'd given James and Linda over $400,000, not counting the mortgage payments. Money for renovations, cars, vacations, private schools, all disguised as emergencies. She'd dipped into her retirement savings, Henry's life insurance, leaving her future precarious. Her phone buzzed with a text from James. Mom, have you thought about what we talked about? Bills are due Friday. No, how are you? No apology, just another demand. Margaret set the phone down, unanswered. The next morning, Margaret booked an appointment with a financial advisor at her bank. Mrs. Reynolds, the advisor, frowned as she reviewed Margaret's accounts. Your retirement savings are well below what they should be for your age, she said. At this rate, you'll run out of money within 6 years of retirement. Margaret nodded, swallowing hard. I've had some family expenses. Mrs. Reynolds showed her the projections. The mortgage payments on James's house were bleeding her accounts dry each month. Do you have other assets? She asked. Just my house, Margaret said. I own it outright. That's a start, Mrs. Reynolds said. But you need to make significant changes to secure your retirement. Margaret left the bank with a folder of grim projections and a knot in her stomach. She called the mortgage company to explore her options. If she removed herself from the loan, James and Linda would need to qualify for it or refinance. If they couldn't, the house would face foreclosure unless payments continued. Next, she visited the county clerk's office to review the paperwork. The house was primarily in her name, with James and Linda as secondary owners. She'd signed most of the documents, with them merely adding their signatures. This gave her power, but also responsibility. Driving home, she passed their house again. This time, she spotted a pool company truck in the driveway. A pool. They were installing a pool while claiming they couldn't pay their bills. Margaret pulled over a block away, her heart pounding. Through a gap in the hedge, she saw Linda with a man, reviewing blueprints. Anger surged, but with it came clarity. That evening, Margaret called Ellen. I need you to be honest, she said. Has James mentioned anything about financial troubles? Ellen hesitated. They just put down $20,000 for a pool, Maggie. Linda said it was an early anniversary gift from you. Margaret closed her eyes, letting the lie sink in. They weren't just taking advantage of her. They were using her name to boast. Thank you for telling me, she said, hanging up. She sat at her kitchen table, opened her laptop, and created a detailed spreadsheet. Every unrepaid loan, every emergency, every luxury disguised as necessity. By midnight, she had a clear picture, 12 years of financial abuse, totaling over $450,000. The next morning, she called the bank to schedule a meeting with a mortgage specialist, then contacted a trusted real estate agent. She also called George, Henry's old real estate attorney friend. After 30 minutes, she understood her options. Continue paying, force a sale, or have James and Linda refinance. If they couldn't refinance, it was back to selling or paying. A week later, James and Linda appeared on her doorstep, more agitated than concerned. Linda stood with her arms crossed, foot tapping. James clutched his phone as if ready to show her bills. Mom? James began, his voice edged with frustration. You haven't answered our calls or texts for a week. What's going on? Come in, Margaret said calmly, leading them to the living room. They sat, Linda still crossing her arms, James glancing around like he wanted to escape. We're in serious trouble, James said. The bank's threatening to foreclose. Our credit cards are maxed out. Which bank? Margaret asked. Summit Financial? I've made every payment on time. James blinked. I mean, the credit cards. We owe about $35,000. And you need me to pay it, Margaret said, not a question. Linda leaned forward. Margaret, I know we had a misunderstanding at the barbecue, but this is serious. We could lose everything. A misunderstanding? Margaret repeated. You called me a plague that ruined your lives. Was that a misunderstanding? Linda flushed but recovered quickly. I was stressed. I say things I don't mean when I'm stressed. Like when you told Ellen the new pool was an anniversary gift from me? Margaret asked. James turned to Linda, stunned. What pool? A $20,000 down payment last week, Margaret said. She said it was from her parents, but her parents didn't give you a dime, did they, Linda? Linda stiffened. My parents. So you lied to me, James said, his voice rising. We're drowning in debt, and you put down $20,000 for a pool? We deserved something nice, Linda snapped. Do you know what people think of us? Margaret watched them argue, seeing their dynamic clearly. Linda demanding, James caving, then both turning to her for rescue. Enough, she said, her voice sharp. They turned to her, surprised by her firmness. She opened a folder on the coffee table. For 12 years, I've given you over $450,000, not including $180,000 in mortgage payments. I've paid for renovations, cars, vacations, schools. I've drained my retirement savings to fund your lifestyle. In return, I've been treated like an ATM at best, a plague at worst. Linda stood furious. Is this why you called us here? To throw your generosity in our faces? No, Margaret said, sliding a document toward them. I called you here because this ends now. I've made the final mortgage payment on your house. I'm done paying. I've also filed to put the house on the market. You can't do that, Linda exploded. It's our house. It's my house, Margaret corrected. My name is first on the deed and mortgage. I've consulted attorneys. I have every right to sell. James went pale. Mom, please, where will we live? That's for you to figure out, James. You're 45. It's time you stood on your own. Linda grabbed her purse, her face contorted. You'll regret this when you're old and alone, with no one to care for you. Margaret met her gaze steadily. I'd rather be alone than used. James stood, his eyes pleading. Mom, we can work this out. I promise we'll change. I hope you do, James, she said softly. But not for me, for yourself. As the door slammed behind them, Margaret sank into her armchair, exhausted but lighter. The house felt quieter, but for the first time in years, the silence didn't weigh on her. Margaret stood on the balcony of her small coastal cottage in St. Augustine, watching the waves glimmer under the sunset. At 69, she'd cut her hair short, letting the silver strands shine, and stopped dyeing it to look younger. She'd learned to live for herself. The 6 months after confronting James and Linda were the hardest of her life, harder even than when Henry died. Back then, she'd had purpose, raising James, preserving their family. Now, she had to discover who Margaret Sullivan was when she wasn't a wife, a mother, or a financial lifeline. The sale of James's house went through quickly in a hot real estate market. She kept her promise, giving them 20% for a new apartment, and put the rest into a retirement fund. Linda spread rumors, painting her as a heartless mother, costing Margaret a few friendships. Some nights, she questioned herself, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. But slowly, she rebuilt. She sold her Tampa house, too big and full of fading memories, and bought this seaside cottage. She joined a book club, took up landscape painting, and made new friends who knew her as Maggie, not someone's mom. Most importantly, she secured her financial future. With the proceeds from both sales and careful budgeting, she'd live comfortably, if not richly. James called after 3 months of silence. Their first talk was awkward, but they slowly rebuilt a new relationship. James and Linda separated. Without Margaret's support, Linda's spending became unsustainable, and James saw her true colors. He worked 2 jobs, lived in a modest apartment, and learned the value of earning his own way. He apologized, not once, but repeatedly, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt his sincerity. Today, James was coming to visit. He texted this morning. "Looking forward to this weekend, Mom. Got some good news to share." Margaret smiled, replying, "Can't wait to hear it. Drive safe." In her cozy cottage, she walked past the paintings on her walls, each a step in her rediscovery. On her nightstand, Henry's photo sat beside a new one of her and James, taken last Christmas. Their smiles were tentative, but they were trying, and that mattered. Catching her reflection in the mirror, Margaret saw a woman with lines telling a story of joy and pain. But there was something else: quiet strength, newfound freedom. "You did it," she whispered. "You built a house for yourself. And this house, this life, was finally, truly hers." Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and please share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear where you're watching from and what this story meant to you. Your voice matters, and I can't wait to connect with you all.